Hey everyone, thanks for joining us at the Progressive Forum, the world's only expressly progressive lecture series. We're based in Houston, Texas. I'm Randall Morton, founder of the Forum. We're excited to present Michael Pollan, acclaimed author of How to Change Your Mind, what the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. I'm grateful to our generous sponsors, Melanie Gray and Mark Wayrow, and Lisa Paris. This live stream is a recorded version of our in-person event in Houston on November the 9th, 2023. It will remain free on our website for viewing. To purchase How to Change Your Mind at a discount, click the link under the screen, and our wonderful partners at Blue Willow Bookshop will send you a copy. And please do consider a voluntary donation to the Progressive Forum by clicking the donation link to keep these free educational worldwide live streams going. Michael Pollan is a professor at UC Berkeley and the author of 6 #1 New York Times bestsellers. I give you Michael Pollan.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be back in Houston, as we pronounce it in New York City.
I never heard that in New York City. Is that?
Yeah, Houston Street.
I need to get out of Houston and find out what
guess
they're saying about
Get
us.
around, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for that introduction, because your candor about your own experiences is it's so important. This has been, mental health in general has been a closeted phenomenon for way too long, and people's experiences with psychedelics too has not been something people felt comfortable talking about, certainly publicly. So thanks for your courage in talking about that.
Yeah, well, thank you. We're all amongst friends here, right?
Yeah.
It's just been so interesting to follow your path. And tell me if I'm wrong, when you started writing about psychedelics, it looked to me like your curiosity was moved in a more personal way. What drew you into psychedelics?
Well, there's a backstory and a front story here. I'd had a long-standing interest in our relationship to plants. People who know my work know I wrote a couple books about plants, more or less. And in Botany of Desire, my third book, I had looked at the different uses to which we put plants. And some of them are kind of obvious and make a lot of sense from an evolutionary point of view, such as food and beauty. But we also have used them always and everywhere, with one exception, to change consciousness. And that's always been an interesting and somewhat mysterious phenomenon to me. Like, why would it be adaptive for people to take plants that consume plants and fungi, mushrooms, that change their consciousness? Changing your consciousness is dangerous in the natural context. You're more vulnerable to predation, presumably. You're more likely to have accidents. You're basically giving up control over yourself and your capabilities. But it must offer us something, or the drug takers would have been edited out by natural selection, and they haven't been. Every culture on Earth, with one exception that we know of, has had some plant that they used to change consciousness. And it could be, in mild ways, the way caffeine changes our consciousness, or to relieve pain like opiates do, or for more profound experiences like psychedelics. The one exception are the Inuit, and the only reason is nothing good grows where they live. When they move to Canada or wherever, they tend to get with the program. So this is a deep human desire, and I've always been curious about it. And I wrote a chapter about cannabis in Botany of Desire. And so it was in the back of my mind as something that I was curious about. And then I started in the early 2010s, I started reading about these very weird sounding experiments going on at Johns Hopkins and NYU. And they were giving a high dose of psilocybin, which is the chemical in magic mushrooms, in a synthetic form, to cancer patients to help them deal with what they called their existential distress, their anxiety and fear around either their impending death or around recurrence of cancer. And this struck me as a very peculiar idea. I just can't imagine receiving a terminal diagnosis and then wanting to have a big psychedelic trip. The loss of control and the unpredictability, it seemed to me might plunge you further into depression and anxiety. But I got an assignment to write about this for The New Yorker for a piece that came out in 2015 called The Trip Treatment. It's available online for free. And I started talking to these volunteers in this trial. And their stories were just fascinating, and that how a single experience with psilocybin had completely reset their attitude toward their death. They were very moving stories, and this was a very sympathetic patient population. I think it was kind of canny on the part of the researchers if you want to get people to take this seriously as a treatment. But I'll just give you an example of one woman I talked to give you a sense of what was happening. This was a woman who was a figure skating instructor who lived in Manhattan, and she was a kind of a slight woman who seemed sort of timid outwardly, and she had had ovarian cancer, and she had been treated successfully. That wasn't the case for all the volunteers. And she was doing very well, but she was paralyzed by the fear of recurrence, which is a common fear for people who've been treated with cancer. And it was just completely interfering with her life. And so she had this guided psilocybin trip. I should just very briefly tell you what the protocol is, because it's not like they just give you a magic mushroom and send you on your way. It's a very controlled situation. You're prepared, you're given a 2 or 3 hour, actually in these trials even more, but several 2-hour sessions of preparation where the therapists get to know you and your anxieties and what your issues are, and they help you set an intention. You mentioned an intention earlier of what you're trying to accomplish. And then they sit with you for the duration of the trip, which can last like 6 hours. There are 2 people there with you, and they do very little. They, might offer a comforting hand or help you get up to go to the bathroom, but they don't direct you in any way. They say very little. They might just ask you, how are you doing? In the preparation, they've told you what to do under certain circumstances. Like if you see something really frightening, they'll tell you, go toward it. Don't go away from it. Don't run from it. If you see a staircase, go up it. If you see a door, open it. In other words, surrender to what's happening. In and through is something they'll tell you. And this is important because I think if you fight to resist what's going on in your mind, that's when you have what we call a bad trip. You get very, very anxious because you can't control what's going on in your mind for a period of time. So in her trip, and this was common of a lot of the cancer patients, she went into her body and took a tour of her body. And while she was doing this, she saw this black mass under her rib cage. And she knew what it was. It wasn't her cancer, right? She had ovarian cancer, so it wasn't in the right place. But she knew it was her fear, this black mass of fear. And as soon as she saw it, she screamed out. She said, "Get the fuck out of my body." Imagine the therapists who don't know what's going on. And with that, it vanished. And her fear went away. And it never came back. And so this was, an astonishing change in her life that happened over the course of an afternoon. Afterwards, you have what's called an integration session where the therapist no doubt said, "What was going on when you said that?" And she told the story, and because the memory of these experiences is quite vivid. These are not like dreams at all. They stick with you for years and years and years. So my experience talking to those people and then seeing the results of this trial, which were quite successful, about 2/3 of people got significant relief. I wrote this article, and about halfway through, I realized there's a book here. I should really write a book about this. There was nothing out that wasn't written by psychonauts, people who were just already obsessed with psychedelics. And if I was going to write a book about it, I had to have this experience myself. I had to understand how a single experience could have that kind of effect on you. So that was the backstory. That's how I came to do it. And I'm very fortunate in that I've had a wonderful book editor for my whole career, for I think 9 books now. And I had a series of successful books about food and nutrition. And when I told her I want to write about psychedelics, she was like, "Go for it." So I'm very lucky. I mean, there's always a lot of pressure to kind of repeat what you've done successfully before, but she was open and happy to have me do something new. So I embarked.
Well, let me stay with death and dying for a moment. It was in the title of your book. In your New Yorker article, as I understand it, the piece that these patients were getting was not about connecting with the afterlife, which you think would be the most comforting. It was something else. What was going on? What was working for them?
Some of them. Some did have glimpses of what would happen to them after. Somebody would describe seeing this one man I focused on who did die, saw this, what he called the great plane of consciousness, and he thought that's where he would go. And it looked like it was a comforting place to be. He was certainly not ready to go now, but he had had a glimpse, and it made him reconciled. In fact, he gave up his chemotherapy after that in favor of having a better quality of life for a shorter amount of time. And that's not an unusual outcome. And for people who work in oncology, you know how significant that is. But then others would have a highly naturalistic experience of the afterlife. This one woman I talked to went flying around the world and ended up going underground and hitting the wall of a crematorium and realizing that she would be dispersed and her molecules would be taken up by these plants. Now, that's not an unrealistic vision of the afterlife, but she found it, because of the psychedelics, incredibly comforting. Like, this is fine. I'm going to be dead, but I'm also going to go on in nature, as part of nature. And so it was a variety. The thing about psychedelics, it doesn't program a particular experience. It all has to do with, set and setting, as you mentioned. These are terms coined by Timothy Leary in the early 60s. And what he's getting at is the fact that the mindset you bring into it, as well as the physical setting or environment in which you have the experience, shapes it to an unusual degree. That there's something kind of unspecific about the drugs. Stan Grof, who was a psychiatrist who worked with psychedelics a lot in the 60s, a Czech who came to America, called them unspecific mental amplifiers. It's not a very felicitous phrase, but he's onto something. They don't necessarily take you here or there. It's really what your intention is and the setting is and what you're bringing to the experience. Whereas, everybody kind of knows what it feels like to ingest marijuana or have alcohol. But with psychedelics, it's highly variable.
People do come away with different interpretations of their trip. Some feel they connected with God, some with a transpersonal mind, others are more materialistic. How do you know what interpretation you can rely on?
Well, rely on, you mean the truth quotient of these interpretations. You can't. William James wrote about this in Varieties of Religious Experience, where he wrote a lot about the mystical experience, which is something that these researchers believe in. It's not the right word, but the mystical experience is something he defined that you see all through the history of religion, but people have them spontaneously. They're not necessarily religious, but it's an experience defined by a few characteristics: a transcendence of self, a sense of merging with something that you described in your introduction, merging with something larger than yourself, transcendence of space and time, a kind of euphoric feeling. It's a well-known phenomenon. It happens in meditation. It happens people who fast or do vision quests or isolate for a long period of time. It's something we're wired for. We don't know why. But psychedelics occasions those experiences fairly reliably. And James wrote about, like, well, how can you say what's true and what's not true? I mean, are these insights, especially these spiritual insights or divine encounters, are they true? And he basically said there's no way to know. We should judge them by their fruits. In other words, if the experience has a positive effect on one's life, that's good enough. He was a pragmatist. And I think that's a pretty healthy attitude. We're never going to be able to say whether it's true or not. There are psychological truths that come out of it that, with the help of a good therapist, and sometimes even without, people have, profound insights into themselves or what they should be doing. People have creative insights too. There's a whole history of scientists having, breakthroughs, imaginative breakthroughs on psychedelics, and there are a great many poets who have. And so, are those true or false? Well, if you have an image on how to build a PCR machine, which Kary Mullis did on an acid trip, he was able to imagine the DNA molecule and how to multiply it, and invented PCR. I guess that was true. It worked.
Your book also includes the title, that is, Depression and Addiction. And your book also gets into difficult to treat conditions like PTSD and eating disorders. What should we understand about these healing breakthroughs from psychedelics?
So psilocybin and MDMA, which is the name for ecstasy, have been the ones that have gotten the most attention from researchers. They're not working with LSD strictly for pragmatic reasons. It carries a lot of baggage politically, but it also is such a long trip that you'd have to pay overtime to your therapists. It can go on for 12 hours, whereas psilocybin is only 6 hours or so. So it kind of fits into the therapeutic day a little better. But they will be doing work on those other psychedelics, and mescaline too, at some point. So they're being trialed for depression, both major depression and treatment-resistant depression, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a really interesting trial going on at Yale right now. Smoking addiction, alcohol addiction, cocaine addiction are all being trialed, and some of those are done and have been successful. And let's see what else. Eating disorders, I think, is underway or just got started at Johns Hopkins. And there's a couple others, about to happen. And, my first reaction when I heard that was, well, what is this, a panacea? I mean, you're trying out all these different things. Why would the same drug work on all those things? And I put this question to Tom Insel, who's a very prominent psychiatrist. He was head of the National Institute of Mental Health. And the first thing he said to me is, why are you so sure those are different things? They all may be symptoms of the same underlying mental disorder, which could be an excessively rigid brain, a mind that is stuck in loops of rumination. So we may discover at some point there is an underlying phenomenon that expresses itself, manifests in all these different ways, which I thought was a very interesting way to think about it. And in fact, there is a group at Mass General at Harvard that is directly studying rumination. What psychedelics appear to do is make it possible to break habits of thought, destructive habits of thought and behavior. Addiction is such a habit, obviously. And how this works, we're not really sure, but there is a kind of relearning, repatterning of the mind that can happen. And it was very striking in the case of the addicts that I interviewed. I interviewed several people in the smoking cessation and the cocaine trial. And in smoking, people would have these experiences. Like this woman described to me, she'd smoked since she was 20 and she was in her 50s. And her trip took her all over the world, and she saw the Taj Mahal and the pyramids. It was like this, grand tour of everything, and it was thrilling. And she came out of it thinking, God, there's so much to do in life and so much to see, and isn't it stupid to smoke cigarettes and shorten your life? Now, this is not a profound insight, and she probably had that thought sober at various times. But there's something about the psychedelic experience that makes sort of semi-banal insights like that feel really earth-shaking and profound and sticky enough to actually act on them. And people make resolutions that actually hold. And she immediately lost her taste for cigarettes. It did feel stupid. It felt like something she didn't need to do. And this goes back to the mystical experience. There's one other characteristic of it that I didn't mention, which is what James called the noetic quality. The fact that the insights you have during a mystical experience have a status. They're more like revealed truth than an opinion or an insight. They just have this, etched on stone tablets quality. So that's part of it. Now, what's going on in the brain? There are two theories that I think are interesting, or three. I'll see if I can quickly outline them. The one I talk about in the book is the fact that they have found, taking fMRI images of people at the height of a psychedelic experience, and can you imagine being like rolled into one of those tubes while tripping? We owe these volunteers a large debt of gratitude for their courage. They have found that what's going on in their brain during this experience is that a particular brain network called the default mode network is deactivated. Now, what is the default mode network? It connects several different brain structures, and without going into their names, that seem to be involved in the generation of the sense of self. Time travel is here, your ability to imagine the future and remember the past, which is very important, obviously, to our identity. Without a sense of the past, you disappear as a person. It's also where theory of mind takes place, our ability to imagine the mind of another, and the narrative self. The way we kind of weave what happens in our lives into the story we tell of who we are. All this is happening in that network. To the extent that you can say the ego has an address in the brain, which is oversimplifying, it's the default mode network. And what was interesting is that when volunteers describe the experience of ego dissolution, there is this sense of complete depersonalization that happens on a high dose, not always, but very often on a high dose of psychedelics. Their default mode network went quiet, and they could correlate this pretty exact, the experience and what we were seeing. Curiously enough, really experienced meditators, when put in an fMRI, people with 10,000 hours or more, they too have a deactivation. The same network goes quiet. So it could be that this muffling or quieting or temporary relief from the voice of your ego, which traps us, of course, in all these loops of rumination. I mean, that's telling that self-critical story, that story about, I'm worthless, I'm unworthy of love, I can't get through the day without a drink, whatever it is being enforced. Those bad patterns are being enforced by the ego. And it may be that having some surcease, some break from that pressure allows people to change. So that's one theory. The other theory that's more recent and has only been demonstrated in animals so far, there's a young researcher named Gül Dolan. She's Turkish, but she lives here, who has done this really interesting work with animals. And her first experiment, which you may have heard of, it got some attention, was to give MDMA to octopuses. Why octopuses? Because they're separate from us by like 40 million years or something like that. And she wanted the most different creature she could find. Octopuses are also incredibly solitary creatures. From the time they mature, they want to be left alone. They go under their rock and that's it. I don't even know how they reproduce, but they don't want to be with other octopuses. She found when she gave them MDMA and then put them in underwater with a choice of two chambers, one where they could socialize with other octopuses and the other where they could go under their rock and be solitary, for a period of weeks after the MDMA, they chose to socialize. Her hypothesis, which she's since demonstrated in several other animals using several different psychedelics, is that, well, this has been well known in psychology since the 30s. We have these critical periods in our development. So there's that critical period from ages like 2 to 4 where you can learn languages like this. You're just like really sticky, and you can even sort. You can learn multiple languages and sort them out. Or in our adolescence, we have this critical period for social learning where we just learn about how the world works and how people are. There's a critical